Ukrainians undertaking the operations to shape the environment for the entry of F-16s. We've seen over the last couple of months in particular, the Ukrainians are hitting Russian air defence missile sites very hard. Whether it was even the S-500 site in Crimea recently, but S-400, S-300 sites have really taken a beating in the last couple of months, as well as their air command and control aircraft. So the Ukrainians are doing everything they can to level the playing field for when these F-16s and their Western weapons arrive.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Major General Mick Ryan, who served for 35 years in the Australian Army, commanding troops in East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also an author, strategist and keynote speaker. General Ryan, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks, James. Great to be with you again.
I wanted to get your assessment, first of all, of what we seem to be seeing on the front line currently. Russia appears to be intensifying their offensive operation in Donetsk Oblast, decreasing the rate of attack in northern Kharkiv Oblast. Does that suggest to you that the recent offensive in the northeast, in Kharkiv, was primarily designed to fix and distract Ukrainian forces?
I think that was certainly a key objective of the Kharkiv offensive, but I don't think it was the only one. Clearly, Putin felt a domestic imperative, given the two attacks into the Belgorod region that the Ukrainians had undertaken in the last year. So he felt some domestic pressure there to be seen to be doing something about that. And he had forecast the establishment of a buffer zone there. So I do think that was also an imperative, but I think the main military aim was to try and draw off Ukrainian reserves so that the Russians could focus on their main effort, which is these offensives in the east.
The buffer zone theory is an interesting one because Ukraine has still been able to strike targets in Belgorod, even whilst Russia have been having this offensive in Kharkiv. So does that really hold up?
Not really, but at least Putin can say to his people he's trying to do something about it. At the end of the day, when you have a neighbour that is right next door, you don't have any kind of air or sea gap. It's very hard to totally close down that border, as the Russians have found.
Of course, the US continues to prohibit Ukrainian forces from striking at legitimate military targets in Russian territory within range of HIMARS rocket launches. They have eased off some of their restrictions, but how much of a hindrance does that remain? The fact that, some would say Ukraine are fighting with one hand tied behind their back.
No, they definitely are fighting with one hand tied behind their back. This restriction on how far the Ukrainians can target their ATACMS missiles from HIMARS launches inside Russian territory. I think it's about 100 kilometres at the moment. Well, the Russians just go, fine, we'll put our headquarters and airfields 150 kilometres away. At the end of the day, Ukraine needs to be able to strike into Russia where the key targets are, regardless how far that is. They are not talking about marching on Moscow. They're not talking about marching on St. Petersburg. They just want to be able to hit military targets that launch aircraft that strike Ukraine.
Why is the US so reluctant, though, to allow them to strike such targets? I mean, they've eased off a bit, as we've discussed, but they are still being quite restrictive. Why do you think that is? Does this go back to this fear of escalation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, all the way through this war, we've seen this fear of escalation. We can't give the Ukrainians self-propelled artillery. That'll be escalatory. Okay, let's give it to them. And we've seen it with tanks. We've seen it with F-16s. We've seen it with HIMARS. I just think at every step there's been this nervousness at the strategic level. Now, of course, as a superpower, you always have to think about another country potentially using nuclear weapons. But the escalatory risk of these weapons being used to strike military bases within Russia is very minimal indeed, and they should be allowed to do it.
And how do you assess the risk of Putin using tactical nuclear weapons?
It's never zero because he has them, but I think it's a very low possibility. And at the end of the day, the one question Putin has to ask his military commanders in thinking about this is, would the use of tactical nuclear weapons fundamentally change the situation on the ground in Ukraine? If they can't give him a definitive yes, and they cannot, it would be very, very unlikely indeed that he'd want to use them because the strategic and political costs are very, very profound.
Well, it might fundamentally change the situation on the ground, but not in his favour, because it might actually provoke a full-scale war with NATO and actually having NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine.
That's right, and these are part of the profound, impacts of the use of nuclear weapons. Not just with NATO, there's a massive environmental cost. There'd be a cost to his own people. I mean, a lot of the fallout would blow back over Russia, and it may just, fix some of those mobilisation of personnel problems Ukraine's having, because anyone who had doubts about joining the Ukrainian military would no longer have those doubts.
But it's interesting the impact of the continued restrictions that the US are putting on Ukraine in terms of the use of its weapons. I mean, according to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian air defenses will reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian F-16s if the US does not allow Ukrainian forces to use ATACMS to destroy Russian air defense systems in Russian territory. I mean, as you mentioned, General, there's been this frustrating pattern throughout this conflict of Ukraine requesting something, whether it's anti-tank missiles, whether it's the F-16s, whatever, finally being granted them. And a lot of people saying, well, if only Ukraine's allies were one step ahead as opposed to one step behind, Ukraine would be in a fundamentally better position at the moment.
No, I think that's the case. I think the end of 2022 will be a great case study of this in particular. I mean, we wrung our hands over the provision of things like tanks in the back half of 2022 and other military materials. And just when the Ukrainians had the Russians on the back foot, we kind of took our boot off the Russians' neck, and they were able to entrench in southern Ukraine, and the rest is kind of history. I think there's a lot to learn from strategic decision making in this war in NATO. And I would hazard a guess that the Chinese are watching very closely at the kind of red lines the Western governments impose on themselves during wartime.
Just hypothetically, and I appreciate counterfactuals are, of course, have their own flaws, but where do you think we would have been now had we treated things differently at the end of 2022?
Yeah, I mean, we could be in exactly the same place, right? But it's interesting to speculate that potentially the Ukrainians might have been able to continue harrowing the Russians after they withdrew from Kherson. Now, that's highly speculative because the Russians actually withdrew in pretty good order out of Kherson, and I think the Ukrainians would have had a pretty hard time of it. But it's interesting to speculate that they might have been be able to force the Russians into a much smaller part of their territory in southern Ukraine. We'll never know.
Talking of the F-16s, we're still waiting for them to be deployed. When do you think that might happen, and how much of a difference will they make?
Well, I think what we're seeing at the moment is Ukrainians undertaking the operations to shape the environment for the entry of the F-16s. We've seen over the last couple of months in particular, the Ukrainians are hitting Russian air defense missile sites very hard. Whether it was even the S-500 site in Crimea recently, but S-400, S-300 sites have really taken a beating in the last couple of months, as well as their air command and control aircraft. So the Ukrainians are doing everything they can to level the playing field for when these F-16s and their Western weapons arrive.
I mean, there's been so much hype around the F-16s. Is there a danger that we are over hyping them as such, that people talk about them almost as a game-changing weapon? But is there such a thing in the context of this war as a game-changing weapon?
I think there's such a thing as a game-changing weapon. I think HIMARS did that. But a game-changing weapon is very different to a silver bullet that can, turn the war and win the war all by itself. Those kind of weapons just don't exist. They never have. And we do need to be careful about overhyping these things. I mean, they will clearly improve the performance of the Ukrainian Air Force, which will help it to support the Ukrainian military on the ground. But are F-16s going to win the war for Ukraine? No, they are not, and even the Ukrainians don't believe that.
So if you were General Siersky and you had to compile almost a military shopping list, at the moment, what would be on it?
Well, the first thing would be to be able to recruit as many people as I need for the front line. I mean, I think that's a really first order issue for the Ukrainians. I mean, the mobilisation debate went on for way too long. Now, they've got the legislation they've wanted, but they still need to be able to recruit people for that. I think that's still going to be an issue. That would be priority one. The second priority is an assured supply of munitions from the West. It's great to have this re-established flow from the US and the step up from Europe. But the last thing the Ukrainians would want is to step off on an offensive in early 2025, only to find that that's all the ammunition they've got for the rest of the year because the Congress is again debating about another package to Ukraine. So I think that would be number two. And then three would just be really expanding the defence industrial base in Ukraine so it can produce its own munitions, its own drones, it can produce its own armoured vehicles, maintain the armoured vehicles that it has. So, my sense is they'd be the big three for General Sierski at the moment. But, he's probably got 100 priorities at the moment trying to balance them all. He's got a very difficult job.
And the defence industrial base, I mean, one of the things we discuss a lot on the Frontline is a general frustration that Europe, not so much the US, but certainly Europe, has been so slow to ramp up its military production that, we've been supporting Ukraine now for more than 2 years, and yet, the West's defence industrial base just hasn't kept pace.
No, I think that's a fair criticism. We have been slow to turn, but to be fair, I think Europe has turned. Probably hasn't gained speed out of that turn just yet. But certainly, you've seen a lot of countries step up their defence spending, step up the amount of support they're providing to Ukraine. And you've seen the Americans expand their capacity. They've more than quadrupled artillery production. What we need to do across the board in Europe, in the United States, and countries like Australia and Japan is step up production of things like precision munitions, of drones, of counter drone munitions, and these kind of things. We're not there yet. We're on a journey there. The question is, can we do it fast enough?
The point about drones is fascinating because obviously ever since the full-scale invasion, Ukraine have been really, really innovative in how they've used commercial drones, essentially, in a battlefield context. But do you think in a way that's almost, some in the West have maybe taken that for granted and thought, well, they'll be all right, they can use these low-cost drones that they've adapted, whereas actually, yeah, they're doing very well, but with a weapon with many limitations?
Well, I think the Ukrainians have kind of stolen a march on a lot of Western countries. We've seen this um, drone warfare coming for some time now. I think both the Ukrainians and Russians are in this very sophisticated adaptation battle to continue developing a whole range of different drone classes, not just in the air, but on the ground and at sea. And these things will have application in every war moving forward. Now, it will depend on geography, it'll depend on terrain. The Western Pacific is very different to Ukraine, so it'll need different drone classes. But even in the Western Pacific, there's big bits of land where these kind of things will be useful.
I just wanted to get your response, General, to some comments made by the leader of the right-wing Reform Party in the UK the other day, Nigel Farage. I'm not sure whether he's a figure you're familiar with in Australia, but he's a big figure over here, a big ally of Donald Trump, shares similar politics. And talking about the war, he said that the West had provoked the war in Ukraine by allowing the EU and NATO to expand too far east. And in response, President Zelensky has said Farage and others have been infected with the Putin virus. What do you make of such comments when you hear words like that from Nigel Farage, but from other Western politicians?
Yeah, I mean, they're speaking directly from the Russian playlist, to be quite frank. These are all talking points from Russia. You hear them rolled out in other countries around the world from politicians who aren't giving this a lot of thought. I mean, the facts are that Ukraine in 1991 voted for its independence. It was overwhelming that they did so. And ever since then, they've been working on joining the EU and NATO, which is their right as a sovereign nation. If that is provocative to authoritarian states who don't want to see an example of a healthy, prosperous, and vibrant democracy on their borders, well, that isn't our fault. That's the authoritarians' fault. So this was a very misguided comment. It's wrong, factually, and quite frankly, it's morally questionable to make these kind of statements as well, I think, from someone who wants to be the leader of a democracy.
How much of a concern is it that we are seeing potentially a rise in political parties in the West, mainstream political parties, who are sceptical about supporting Ukraine? We've got upcoming parliamentary elections in France, the Populist National Rally Party, who traditionally have been more sympathetic towards Russia are expected to do very well. I mentioned Nigel Farage potentially doing well in the UK, and obviously Donald Trump. We wait to see what happens in November. How much of a concern is that maybe in a year's time, the political leadership in the West that so far has been very steadfast in support for Ukraine could look very different?
No, absolutely, it could. It will really depend on the will of the voters at the end of the day. I mean, they get the politicians they vote for. There's clearly a mood amongst a proportion of the electorate in many countries where people purely want to focus on tackling things like inflation, cost of living, house rent, cost of buying your groceries, and these kind of things. That's a natural thing. But at the end of the day, wealthy countries, democracies need to focus beyond just their own needs because democracies exist within a network. And that entire network has to be healthy. And if one democracy is in peril, all democracies in peril, we can't afford not to protect Ukraine, to support Ukraine or any other countries that come under threat, like Taiwan.
And if democracies exist in a network, what we've seen in the last week is that autocracies increasingly operate in a network as well. Obviously, we've had Vladimir Putin's trip to North Korea to visit Kim Jong Un. What did you make of that?
It says to me when you've got to make friends with someone like the leader of North Korea, things aren't going terribly well for you. That's not a sign of strategic success, to be quite frank. That you have to be friendly with that kind of regime, with that kind of awful, repulsive leadership. Um, but at the end of the day, as Freedom House has found over the last few days, last few years, democracy is in decline. There are more countries with more authoritarian tendencies, but the big four of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran represent an authoritarian quad. They may not have a formal entente or alliance, but they certainly have a shared worldview, which is to push back and collapse the global arrangements that have been in place since the end of the Second World War. That your predecessors and mine fought very hard to establish and fought very hard to sustain over the last 70 years.
Do you think it was a strategic mistake almost, or a strategic blunder from Putin to go to North Korea and make such a play of that? Because, there's now talk of South Korea arming Ukraine and doing more to support Ukraine. So, in that sense, is it a strategic error from Putin?
I think so, but Putin's never been a great strategist. He's an opportunist, not a strategist, and he's really kicked himself in the pants with this North Korea arrangement. Because as much as North Korea might provide, the support that South Korea could provide to Ukraine is even more important. They are the producer of large numbers of modern weapon systems, from tanks to artillery to munitions, in quantities that no Western nation comes anywhere near. So I think this is a very significant strategic misstep from Putin. I think it could well hurt him over the next year or so.
And the munitions that North Korea is able to provide to Russia for use in Ukraine, how effective are they?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about quality. At the end of the day, most of them work, and that's all you need. They're not precision munitions by and large. They're the kind of munitions you need for artillery regiments the kind of ballistic missiles that the Russians don't really care if their circular error probability is a bit larger. I mean, the Russians don't care about civilian casualties. So they do the job. But I would sense too that the Russians are probably providing technical assistance to the North Korea and intelligence feedback to improve the quality of their munitions. And that could well be part of the feedback, or at least the Russian part of this deal. It'll be interesting to see what else the Russians are providing.
I wanted to ask you, General, you wrote an article recently about so-called turtle tanks. Just tell us a bit about them, and what are they, first of all?
Yeah, we started seeing these things in April. They're basically an armoured vehicle, mostly tanks, but other forms of armoured vehicles that have these massive turtle shell-like metal enclosures on top. And we've seen subsequent generations add electronic warfare countermeasures, mine rollers, cages over the metallic exterior. They have several missions. They're used to basically cross that dangerous zone between your assembly areas and the forward line of enemy troops from a Russian perspective. They're used to carry Russian troops. They're used to breach Ukrainian electronic networks. They're used to ensure that drones can't take out other armoured vehicles. So I think what we're seeing is the Russians experiment with a few mission sets in these turtle tanks. I think the turtle tanks themselves are an evolutionary dead end, but they're experimenting with some functions that we might see distributed among other vehicles and other units on the battlefield in future.
That's interesting. What kind of functions do you think could be picked up by other units?
Well, I think a more distributed and automated approach to countering Ukrainian drones. FPVs are clearly a very dangerous threat to the Russians. I think more protected means of getting troops across, from your line of departure into the forward troops of the adversary. Obstacle clearance, clearly that is a big deal, whether it's mine detection and clearance or other kinds of obstacles. So there's a few different functions here that we might imagine that could be distributed with uncrewed ground vehicles and other vehicles in future.
You say it's, in the grander sense, an innovative dead end. How much innovation are we seeing in tank warfare at the moment? I mean, if you look at, the Second World War, for instance, there was huge innovation and huge developments over the course of that war. How much innovation are we seeing currently?
I think we're seeing a lot of innovation from both sides. We only see a small proportion of the battlefield. Sometimes I feel like we're looking at it through a straw. But I think with tanks, you're not seeing mass tank warfare. We haven't for some time, but we are seeing tanks used for indirect fire support and these kind of things. They're constantly on the move. They're used in small groups. What we saw in the Gulf War in 1991 or in the Battle of Alamein or in Western Europe just isn't happening. So we are seeing innovation in tactics. But at the end of the day, at the moment, the defence is the stronger part of war. And I think both sides are really struggling to come up with the innovative new tactics to get back on the offence. You can't win the war, you can't win any war by staying on the defence permanently. You need some kind of offensive capability at the tactical or operational strategic level. And I think both sides are kind of struggling to come up with a new approach to that.
Just to go back to something you mentioned earlier, General, you talked about the issue of mobilisation and the need from a Ukrainian perspective just for more boots on the ground. Do you think we will see? I mean, Zelensky already earlier this year lowered the age of conscription from 27 to 25. We've talked about this a lot on Frontline. People saying, "Well, fine, but why only 25? Why can't it be younger still?"
Well, I think what you have to do when you have that conversation is have a look at the Ukrainian demographic tree. Unfortunately, at the end of the Cold War, there was a massive decrease in birth rates in many countries, including Ukraine. So, what that means, if you have a look at the Ukrainian demographic tree at the moment, that those groups between 15 and 30 are very, very small indeed, particularly if you compare them to, say, Britain or Australia or America. It's a concave part of their tree. So they don't have large numbers of people in this age group. Uh, on top of that, Ukraine lost about 10% of its population as refugees at the start of the war. They've also lost a huge number of casualties. They need to be able to keep their population growing post-war. So they're balancing off all these considerations as part of the national demography now and in the future. So when you have a look at it from that perspective, I think these kind of age limitations do make a lot of sense, but you've really got to have a look at Ukrainian demography for it to make sense.
And morale, presumably, is a serious concern as well, because throughout this conflict, we've seen a highly motivated Ukrainian forces, and yet, now we've got some stories, and they may be exacerbated, but you hear stories of deserters or draft dodgers or whatever, and the narrative around Russia making progress in the northeast and the Ukrainian counteroffensive having stalled. Is that a big concern?
It's part of every war. I mean, this is nothing new, to be quite frank. Even the greatest generation, as it fought its way through the hedgerows, through to Berlin and across the Pacific towards Tokyo, they still had malingerers and deserters and this kind of behaviour going on. It's just part of any military organisation in any country in peace and war. I mean, clearly you don't want too much of it, and good leadership, good direction is part of avoiding it. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be a proportion of your force and a proportion of your population in any country that is going to engage in this behaviour.
When do you think we may see a fresh Ukrainian counteroffensive?
Yeah, I've been pondering this a lot. I don't know that we'll see it this year. I mean, I think there's a lot of reconstitution going on. I think there's a lot of bleeding the Russians to occur yet this year. And, at the end of the day, Russian brigades on the front line are really having a tough time with getting sufficient people and dealing with these Russian offensives. I think at some point we'll see this Russian offensive that's been going on for months now culminate. They've still got a little while to go. There may be opportunities there for limited offensive operations, but any large scale offensive operation, I just can't see that happening, for at least 6 months, potentially next year. But, there's a whole lot of ammunition to sort out, there's a whole lot of people to recruit, and there's a whole lot of tactics to fix up so you can successfully undertake offensive operations.
Major General Mick Ryan, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks, James. Great to talk to you.